It began quietly, almost too quietly, the kind of silence that usually means something far bigger is building beneath the surface. 4 months, the WNBA insisted everything with its new CBA negotiations was progressing smoothly, that both sides were working toward a deal that would carry the league into a bold new era. Executives spoke with confidence, players tried to remain patient, and fans assumed the moment of breakthrough was right around the corner. But behind that calm front, frustration simmered. Players whispered among themselves in locker rooms and group chats, agents exchanged uneasy phone calls, and insiders began to sense something was deeply wrong. What was supposed to be the most important deal in league history was collapsing from the inside, and the breaking point arrived the moment Caitlin Clark, the player the league was quietly counting on to stabilize everything, decided she would not sign the proposal placed in front of her. Clark's rejection didn't just send shockwaves through the league. It set off a chain reaction no one could stop. Owners scrambled to figure out how negotiations derailed so quickly. Fans who had watched the WNBA explode in popularity over the past 2 seasons felt betrayed and confused. And players across the league suddenly found themselves confronting the possibility they had tried to avoid from the beginning, a 2026 lockout that could reshape women's basketball forever. Even insiders who had been optimistic early in the process were now forced to admit the truth. The negotiations were not progressing, they were sinking. From the moment early details leaked, players felt the same familiar sting they had felt in negotiations years prior. They wanted growth that reflected the surge in ratings, ticket sales, and sponsorships. They wanted salaries that matched the visibility they were bringing to the league. They wanted respect. And instead, they felt like they were being handed the same structure with a shiny new wrapper. At first, the headline number, the so-called $1.1 million max salary, looked like the step forward everyone had been waiting for. Fans celebrated online. Media outlets blasted it across social feeds. Some players even let themselves believe for a moment that the league had finally listened to them. But when the excitement faded and the fine print surfaced, the truth hit like a gut punch. The $1.1 million wasn't a salary at all. It was a fantasy number built almost entirely on incentives so strict, so layered, and so unforgiving that only a handful of players could ever realistically hit them. Miss a game because of injury? Say goodbye to the biggest chunk. Play on a team that struggles? Tough luck. Need rest after a grueling travel stretch? There goes another portion. And worst of all, many of the benchmarks weren't even under a player's control. It was a deal that pretended to reward excellence but punished players for being human. Veterans recognized the tactic instantly. They had lived through previous negotiations where the league dangled big numbers in front of the public while burying the real details beneath layers of conditions and vague promises. Younger players, especially those who had entered the league during its massive surge in popularity, were stunned by how disconnected the proposal felt from the reality they were living. International players were baffled by the lack of clarity. Bench players were terrified of how much of their income depended on perfect health and perfect circumstances. Everywhere you looked, frustration was brewing. And through all of that frustration, one name surfaced in every conversation: Caitlin Clark. The league had banked on her star power becoming the glue that would hold everything together. She was the ratings magnet, the jersey seller, the face of the WNBA's new era, a player whose impact stretched far beyond basketball. From the moment she stepped into the league, Clark brought in millions of new eyeballs and essentially rewrote the trajectory of the sport. The league believed that if she accepted the deal, everyone else would follow. But that belief would become their biggest miscalculation. Clark, despite being a rookie, understood the responsibility that came with her influence. She didn't want to be used as a marketing tool to mask a deal that didn't respect the players she shared the floor with. And she wasn't about to be the face of a proposal that ignored the very concerns players had been raising for years. When word spread that Clark refused to sign, the shift across the league was immediate and powerful. Younger players felt validated. Veterans felt supported. Those who were hesitant suddenly found their voices. If the biggest star in the sport wasn't signing, they weren't signing. Her stance didn't divide the league. It unified it. Still, the issue ran much deeper than salaries. When ESPN reporter Alexa Crust revealed that even players sitting at the bargaining table didn't know how revenue sharing would actually be calculated, the frustration turned to anger. For years, players had pushed for real revenue sharing, something tied to the league's growth, something concrete. But the league's proposal didn't even define what counted as revenue. There was no percentage, no formula, no transparency at all, just vague assurances that did little to address what players had been asking for since the beginning. It wasn't just a lack of clarity. It was a lack of respect. That was the final straw for many players. They felt the league didn't see them as partners but as employees who should simply accept whatever was offered. They had watched the WNBA praise its growth in interviews and advertisements, yet ignore that same growth when it came time to pay the athletes driving it. For the players, it no longer mattered how attractive the headline numbers looked. What mattered was the principle. What mattered was honesty. What mattered was the future of the league, not just next year but 10 years from now. When journalist Andy Cosmo published a report confirming what many feared, that the two sides were nowhere close to agreeing, everything spilled into the public eye. The article made it clear a lockout wasn't just possible. It was likely. Instead of progress there was stalemate. Instead of transparency there was confusion. And instead of partnership there was resentment. The league had underestimated the players' unity. They had underestimated the pressures of the modern sports landscape. And most importantly, they had underestimated Caitlin Clark's willingness to take a stand. Once Clark's rejection became public, the narrative changed instantly. Media outlets framed it as the turning point. Fans demanded answers. Sponsors asked questions. Analysts debated whether the league was prepared for the consequences. And just like that, the WNBA found itself in the middle of a crisis it didn't expect and wasn't prepared to manage. A lockout, something fans once thought impossible, now felt like an impending reality. The idea of a 2026 lockout terrified league executives. A stoppage during the biggest surge of popularity in league history would freeze momentum, threaten sponsorships, and fracture relationships with networks. It would force fans who had just discovered the league to turn elsewhere. And with Saudi-backed leagues and overseas contracts offering massive financial opportunities, WNBA players wouldn't be left without options. The negotiating power the league once held had vanished. But for the players, a lockout was beginning to feel more like a necessity than a threat. They had asked politely. They had been patient. They had trusted the process. And every time they had been told to wait just a little longer. Now, for the first time in the league's existence, the players believed they had the leverage, the visibility, and the unity to demand real change. Not symbolic gestures. Not flashy headlines. Real structural change that would strengthen the league for generations to come. The situation now rests at a crossroads. The WNBA can either choose transparency, fairness, and meaningful progress, or it can continue down the path that leads straight into the lockout players are already preparing for. Clark's refusal didn't create the crisis, but it revealed it. It exposed a league struggling to navigate its newfound popularity and a player base tired of being undervalued. The next steps the league takes will define the future of women's basketball. Whether that future is built on partnership or conflict depends on whether the WNBA finally decides to listen.